The sun hung low over the vast New Mexico desert, spilling molten gold across endless dunes of sand and jagged red rock. The land breathed history, an ancient silence broken only by the whisper of dry winds carrying dust, grit, and forgotten tales. In the distance, the crumbled ruins of a once proud adobe settlement clung stubbornly to the earth, its broken walls and hollow windows staring like empty eyes across the valley. This was no ordinary ruin, it was said to be cursed, a place where settlers, wanderers, and even hardened outlaws dared not tread after sundown. Local whispers told of voices in the wind, of phantom hoofbeats echoing across the canyon long after the riders had vanished, and of shadows flickering in torchlight where no flame burned. Few believed these tales, yet fewer were brave enough to test them. Travelers passing along the Santa Fe Trail would quicken their pace when the ruins appeared in sight, their eyes fixed forward, refusing to look too long. But those who lingered spoke of something strange, an almost magnetic pull, as if the land itself begged them to remember a story buried deep beneath the dust. And so the legend begins, with the tragic dawn of a settlement that rose with hope, flourished briefly, and then fell under the weight of betrayal, greed, and an unforgiving land. In the mid-1800s, when New Mexico still felt like the edge of the world, a caravan of settlers rolled their wagons into the valley, led by a man named Elias Crowe. He was a towering figure of determination, a dreamer hardened by the frontier, who believed this land could be tamed. With his wife and 2 children by his side, and a group of 20 families behind him, he staked a claim at the base of a mesa where the soil promised crops and the nearby river promised life. They built with adobe and sweat, carving homes from earth and rock, raising corrals for livestock, and planting fields under the unrelenting desert sun. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. The town, christened Las Piedras, began to thrive, attracting traders, drifters, and opportunists passing through on the way to Santa Fe. But prosperity always draws shadows. With every wagonload of silver ore discovered in the nearby hills, with every deal struck in the saloon, the line between neighbor and enemy blurred. And deep beneath the surface, where Spanish missionaries had once buried sacred relics centuries earlier, greed stirred awake. Old maps hinted at treasure hidden within the desert soil, gold and silver interred beneath the church that Elias built to anchor the town's faith. Soon, whispers of this hidden fortune spread like wildfire, planting the seeds of suspicion and betrayal that would one day tear Las Piedras apart. The cracks in Las Piedras began subtly, almost invisibly, like hairline fractures in glass. At first, it was no more than a quarrel between neighbors over irrigation ditches, or accusations of livestock straying into the wrong corral. Yet beneath these minor disputes lurked something deeper, something seeded by the rumors of buried treasure beneath the church. Elias Crowe had never spoken of such things, dismissing them as superstition and dangerous talk. But whispers have a way of spreading, especially in towns built on hope and desperation. By lantern light in the saloon, over whiskey poured by trembling hands, men speculated about Spanish priests hiding chests of silver centuries ago, sealing them under the very foundation where the adobe church now stood. The more they spoke, the more real it became, until the legend was no longer a fable but a certainty in their minds. Outlaws passing through fueled the fire, selling crude maps marked with crosses, claiming their grandfathers had seen friars burying relics and gold. Whether true or false mattered little, belief was enough. And so, what began as curiosity turned into obsession. Families who once prayed together now eyed each other with suspicion. At night, shadows crept near the church, figures digging in the dust by torchlight, covering their tracks before dawn. Elias tried to quash the madness, warning that such greed would undo them all, but even his closest allies began to doubt him. Was he protecting the sanctity of the church, or hiding the treasure for himself? Trust, once the foundation of Las Piedras, began to erode like sandstone in a storm. As the tension grew, the land itself seemed to turn against the settlers. The summer sun scorched their crops into brittle husks, cattle weakened and died by the riverbank, and storms swept down from the mountains, tearing through roofs and flooding the streets. To the weary townsfolk, these hardships were not just misfortune, they were punishment. The preacher, his voice trembling in the pulpit, declared that God was angry, that the treasure buried beneath holy ground was cursed, and that their greed had awakened a wrath older than the desert itself. Fear tightened its grip around Las Piedras, twisting neighbors into enemies and stirring violence in once peaceful men. A trader was found beaten on the edge of town, his map stolen. A ranch hand vanished after boasting he'd uncovered gold beneath the church. Rumors claimed his ghost was seen wandering the mesa at night, torch in hand, his face pale and sunken as if death had spat him back. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers loaded rifles by the door, and the once thriving town began to choke on its own paranoia. Elias Crowe, who had once dreamed of a shining future in the New Mexico frontier, now walked the streets with hollow eyes, watching the dream he had built slip through his fingers. And as the sun bled crimson over the mesa each evening, it was said you could hear faint chanting on the wind, the echoes of Spanish voices long dead, calling out warnings that no one heeded. By the time autumn fell, Las Piedras was no longer the town Elias had carved from dust, but a settlement divided into factions, each clutching their own version of the truth. On one side stood those who still followed Elias, desperate to cling to stability, believing the town could survive if they held fast to order. On the other were the treasure seekers, men and women hardened by hunger, greed, and superstition, who claimed destiny had brought them here to uncover what lay beneath the earth. In the middle were the frightened families who longed only for peace, swayed by whichever voice spoke loudest that week. The saloon became the war room of the ambitious, its smoky haze thick with plans to break into the church, to dig beneath its altar until the fabled riches were found. They told themselves it was survival, that the silver and gold could save them from famine and drought, but their eyes glowed with something darker, something unholy. When Elias stood before them in the saloon one evening, demanding they stop, he was met not with respect but with jeers. His once commanding presence had withered under months of hardship, and the crowd no longer saw him as a leader but as an obstacle. Some shouted that he was hoarding the treasure for himself, that he and the preacher had conspired to keep the riches hidden. A bottle smashed against the wall near his head, and for the first time, Elias felt the cold weight of fear in his chest, not of the desert, not of starvation, but of his own people. The breaking point came on a night when the moon hung blood-red over the mesa. A group of men, their faces hidden by scarves, stormed the church, kicking down its doors and dragging the preacher into the street. They tied him to the gallows that had once stood as a symbol of justice for outlaws, demanding he reveal the treasure's location. The preacher wept, insisting no such treasure existed, but his cries were drowned out by the roar of the mob. Elias rushed into the square, his voice echoing across the buildings as he begged them to see reason, but reason was long gone. The mob descended on the church, shovels and pickaxes tearing into the floor, breaking apart the adobe altar, splintering holy relics beneath their boots. For hours they dug, until sweat soaked their shirts and their hands bled from the effort. And when dawn came, there was nothing, no chest of gold, no silver bars, only hollow earth and broken faith. But the mob could not accept the truth. They turned their rage on Elias and the preacher, declaring that the treasure had been moved, hidden elsewhere, stolen from under their noses. Accusations flew like bullets, neighbors who had once built homes together now pointing rifles at each other. That morning, Las Piedras descended into chaos. Gunfire rattled through the streets, families fled with what little they could carry, and the dream of a thriving frontier town was consumed by smoke and blood. By the week's end, Las Piedras stood abandoned, its adobe walls crumbling, its streets silent but for the wind that carried away the echoes of greed and betrayal. The town was dead, and its ruins would forever bear the mark of the curse that greed had written in blood. Years passed, and the desert slowly swallowed what remained of Las Piedras. The adobe walls crumbled into heaps of clay, the saloon doors rotted from their hinges, and the church, once the heart of the settlement, collapsed in upon itself. What had once been a town filled with laughter, prayer, and hope became nothing more than a skeleton against the horizon, a silent witness to the dangers of greed and suspicion. Travelers along the Santa Fe Trail spoke in hushed tones as they passed the ruins, telling their children not to look too closely, for fear of catching the attention of restless spirits. Some claimed to see ghostly figures standing atop the mesa at twilight, watching with hollow eyes. Others swore they heard the sound of shovels striking stone, even though no living soul dared dig there again. Old-timers insisted the curse of Las Piedras was real, that the land itself had turned against those who defiled its sacred ground. Elias Crowe's fate became legend. Some said he vanished into the desert, walking until the sand consumed him, his voice echoing in the wind like a broken prayer. Others claimed he lived on in secret, hiding in the mountains, wandering as a broken man who had seen his dream burn to ash. The preacher's name was etched into the memory of those who survived, remembered as the man who had been strung to the gallows for nothing more than refusing to feed the madness of gold fever. But the truth, like the treasure itself, was lost to time. Whether Elias had been right all along, whether there truly had been something buried beneath the church, remained a question no one could answer. And so Las Piedras lived on, not as a thriving town, but as a ghost story whispered in the desert winds of New Mexico, a tale of ambition turned to ruin, of faith destroyed by suspicion, and of hope devoured by greed. To this day, the ruins stand as a reminder that in the Wild West, the greatest danger was not always the outlaws or the desert itself, but the darkness men carried in their own hearts. And so the legend of Las Piedras became another forgotten scar of the frontier, a place where hope once bloomed, only to be crushed by greed. If you want more stories of the untold Wild West, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a tale of courage, betrayal, and survival.